The highway stretched endlessly into the night, its black ribbon of asphalt disappearing into a foggy abyss. Jack Harper had been a truck driver for nearly 20 years, but something about this particular night felt off. The radio crackled faintly, the static and snippets of country music doing little to keep him company. His 18-wheeler rumbled along the empty road, the headlights cutting through the mist, revealing nothing but the occasional road sign and barren trees swaying in the wind. It was nearing 2 a.m. and the weight of exhaustion pressed heavily on Jack. He sipped from his thermos of lukewarm coffee, grimacing at its bitter taste. The thought of pulling over to rest briefly crossed his mind, but he dismissed it. The delivery deadline loomed, and he'd driven this route dozens of times before. He told himself it was just another long haul, even as the uneasy quiet of the night seemed to seep into his bones. The road was unusually empty, not another vehicle in sight for miles. Jack couldn't help but glance into his rearview mirrors occasionally, half expecting to see headlights trailing him, but there was nothing, just an oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow everything beyond the reach of his taillights. Then he saw her. At first, Jack thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. A figure emerged in the distance, faint and wavering in the fog. As his truck drew closer, the shape solidified into a young woman standing by the side of the road. She wore a thin dress and a scarf, her arms crossed tightly against the cold. Her face, illuminated by the headlights, was pale and almost ghostly, her dark hair clinging to her cheeks in damp strands. Jack instinctively eased his foot off the accelerator. A part of him screamed not to stop. Stories of highway ambushes and criminals posing as stranded travelers flashed through his mind. But another part, the better part, he hoped, told him he couldn't just leave her there. The night was fragile, so out of place. She blushed and clung to him. "Damn it," he muttered, pulling the truck to the shoulder. Jack rolled down the passenger side window and leaned over. "You okay, miss?" he called out, his voice tinged with concern. The woman stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. Her eyes were downcast, and for a moment, Jack thought she might ignore him. But then she looked up, her expression soft but distant, as if she were seeing something far away. "Can you take me home?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a simple request, but something about the way she said it sent a chill down Jack's spine. "Where do you live?" he asked cautiously. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. Jack took it and smoothed it out on the dashboard. The address was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged, but legible enough. "That's a few miles off this road," Jack said, glancing at her. "You sure you're all right?" She nodded, her pale face framed by the scarf that clung to her neck. "I just need to get home," she murmured. Against his better judgment, Jack unlocked the passenger door. The woman climbed in, her movements graceful but hesitant. She settled into the seat, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. Her dress was damp, and Jack noticed her bare feet, dirty and scratched, as she tucked them under her. "Old night to be out walking," he said, trying to break the tension. She didn't respond, staring out the window instead. Jack sighed and shifted the truck back into gear. The engine growled as they pulled back onto the road, the fog seeming thicker now, enveloping them in an eerie cocoon. The silence in the cab was heavy, broken only by the low hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the suspension. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He glanced at the woman out of the corner of his eye. She sat rigidly, her face turned toward the window. The dim glow of the dashboard lights cast faint shadows across her features, making her look even paler. "So, Jack began, clearing his throat. "What were you doing out there?" "I got lost," she said softly. Her voice had a strange, hollow quality, as if she were speaking from somewhere far away. "Lost?" Jack repeated. "Where were you coming from?" She didn't answer. Instead, she shifted slightly in her seat, pulling the scarf tighter around her neck. Jack noticed her hands trembling and assumed she was cold. "There's a blanket in the back if you need it," he offered, nodding toward the small sleeper cab behind them. "Fine," she replied, her tone flat. Jack gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening. He wasn't one to spook easily, but there was something about this woman, something he couldn't put his finger on, that unnerved him. He decided to focus on the road, telling himself he'd drop her off and be on his way soon enough. Minutes passed in uneasy silence. The fog grew denser, and Jack found himself leaning forward, squinting to see the road ahead. The woman suddenly spoke, her voice startling him. "Be careful on this road." Jack glanced at her, his heart skipping a beat. "Why do you say that?" She didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the window. Jack felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He wanted to press her for more information but decided against it. Something about her demeanor told him he wouldn't get a straight answer. As they drove, Jack noticed something peculiar. The headlights illuminated the fog ahead, but the further they went, the denser and more impenetrable it seemed. The trees lining the road appeared warped, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes that clawed at the sky. The oppressive silence outside the cab felt almost alive, pressing in on them like a physical force. Jack shook his head, trying to dispel his growing unease. He turned the radio dial, hoping for some music or even static to break the silence, but all he got was an unsettling hiss. With a frustrated sigh, he turned it off. "Almost there," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He glanced at the address again and realized they were only a few minutes away. The woman turned to him suddenly, her eyes wide and filled with an emotion Jack couldn't quite place. Fear? Sadness? "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. Jack nodded, unsure of how to respond. Something about her expression made his throat tighten. He kept his eyes on the road, the tension in the cab thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, the truck's GPS announced their arrival. Jack slowed down, scanning the side of the road for the address. The house came into view, an old, weathered structure partially obscured by overgrown trees. It looked as though it had been plucked straight out of a ghost story, its peeling paint and sagging porch giving it an air of abandonment. Jack pulled the truck to a stop and turned to the woman. "Here we are," he said. But the seat beside him was empty. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the vacant passenger seat. His hands trembled slightly as he ran them over the worn fabric, hoping to find some evidence that she had been there. But there was nothing. No indent, no lingering warmth. The door was still locked, just as he had left it. Lupids. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the sound of the engine idling. He climbed out of the truck and approached the house, the gravel crunching under his boots. The structure loomed ahead, its broken shutters and dark windows making it look more like a mausoleum than a home. Jack hesitated on the porch, his knuckles hovering over the door, before finally knocking. The sound echoed unnaturally, as though the house were hollow inside. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly man. His face was lined with age, his eyes sunken but alert. Behind him, a woman appeared, her expression wary but curious. "Can we help you?" the man asked, his voice gravelly. Jack cleared his throat, feeling a bit foolish. "Yeah, sorry to bother you this late, but I just dropped off a young woman here. She gave me this address," he said, holding up the crumpled paper. The elderly couple exchanged a look, their expressions shifting from confusion to something darker. The woman stepped closer, her hands wringing nervously. "What did she look like?" she asked softly. Jack described her, the pale skin, the damp dress, the scarf. As he spoke, the woman's eyes widened, and she brought a trembling hand to her mouth. "That sounds like our daughter," the man said, his voice breaking slightly. Jack felt a wave of relief, thinking he had simply reunited a family. "Oh, good. Well, she's here now, so I'll just—" "No," the man interrupted, shaking his head. "You don't understand. Our daughter died 10 years ago, on this road." "Why are you allowing him to live in this apartment?" Keller asked. The words hit Jack like a physical blow. He stared at the couple, their grief etched into their faces, and suddenly felt the air leave his lungs. That can't be," he stammered. "I just picked her up. She was sitting right there in my truck." The woman nodded solemnly. "You wouldn't be the first. People have seen her before, always on that stretch of road. She just wants to come home." Jack stepped back, his heart pounding. The fog seemed thicker now, pressing against the house like a living thing. He didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded and turned back toward his truck. Climbing back into the cab, Jack shut the door and locked it instinctively. His mind raced, replaying the events of the past hour. He reached for the ignition but paused, his eyes falling on the passenger seat. There, lying neatly folded, was the scarf. It was damp and cold to the touch, just as it had been when she wore it. Jack's hands shook as he picked it up, the fabric slipping through his fingers like water. It smelled faintly of earth and something floral, something old. Jack stared at the scarf, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The memory of her voice echoed in his mind. "Be careful on this road." He placed the scarf on the dashboard and started the engine, desperate to leave the house behind. As he pulled onto the road, the fog seemed to part, just enough to guide him forward. But the unease lingered, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. When he finally reached the nearest town, he parked at a diner and sat in the truck for a long time, staring at the scarf. He didn't know what to do with it, didn't even know what to believe anymore. All he knew was that he'd never take that stretch of highway again, not if he could help it. The city above bustled with life, a labyrinth of streets teeming with cars, chatter, and neon lights. But beneath the surface lay a different world, one of silence and shadow. The abandoned subway tunnels that twisted below the city had been forgotten by most, save for the occasional urban explorer or desperate soul seeking shelter. Among locals, these tunnels had gained a sinister reputation. For years, whispers persisted about disappearances tied to the depths, and tales of a creature that was neither fully human nor beast circulated like ghost stories at a campfire. "It's just an urban legend," Emily said, scrolling through articles on her phone. She was the skeptic of the group, her dark hair tucked behind her ears as she leaned against the park bench. "No one's actually seen it. That's because no one who sees it lives to tell the tale," Marcus said with a grin, his enthusiasm undeterred. He was the thrill seeker, the one always pushing boundaries, often to the frustration of the others. Ryan, the unofficial leader of their little crew, sat across from them, studying an old map of the city's underground system. "If we're doing this, we need to stick together. No wandering off, no stupid dares. Agreed?" "Hey!" Mia, who had been quiet up to this point, shifted uneasily. Her green eyes darted between the group. "I still don't think this is a good idea." "People have gone missing down there," said Pollyanna. "God's curious patience, do you find, darling?" "Exactly why we need to check it out," Marcus said, slinging an arm around her shoulder. "Come on, Mia. Think of the views on our channel. The night we face the urban cave creature, it'll go viral." Mia shrugged him off but didn't argue further. The plan was already set, and she knew Marcus would do it, with or without her. That night, the four of them gathered at the entrance to an old maintenance tunnel. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and just enough courage to mask their fear, they slipped through the rusted gate and descended into the darkness. The air grew colder as they ventured further into the tunnels, their footsteps echoing off the damp walls. The once vibrant graffiti near the entrance gave way to faded scrawls and ominous symbols. The beams of their flashlights barely penetrated the heavy darkness, revealing only glimpses of the cracked concrete and rusted rails ahead. "Anyone else feel like we're walking into a horror movie?" Mia whispered, clutching her flashlight tightly. Marcus chuckled. "Relax. Worst thing down here is probably a rat." Emily's eyes darted to the shadows. "Yeah, let's hope it's just rats." Ryan led the way, map in hand, occasionally stopping to check their bearings. "We're heading toward an old section that hasn't been used in decades. Should be where most of the stories come from." "Stories?" Mia asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Disappearances, mostly," Ryan said matter-of-factly. "People say the creature lives deeper in, but no one knows for sure. Or maybe it's all a load of crap," Emily added, trying to sound confident. The group pressed on, the tunnel narrowing slightly as they ventured deeper. Strange noises began to punctuate the silence, the distant drip of water, the faint rustle of something unseen, the occasional groan of shifting metal. Each sound made them jump, though no one dared to admit it. Finally, they reached an intersection where the walls were marked with deep, jagged grooves. Marcus ran his hand over one, whistling softly. "That's not from a rat." Using the grenade launcher, "Maybe someone brought tools down here to mess with explorers," Emily suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. Ryan knelt by the ground, his flashlight illuminating a pile of bones. Some were yellowed with age, others disturbingly fresh. The smell of decay hung in the air. "What the hell?" Mia said, backing away. Marcus leaned in for a closer look, grinning despite the unease on his face. "All right, now it's getting interesting." "We should leave," Mia insisted. "Now." Ryan hesitated, torn between caution and the thrill of discovery. Before he could decide, a sound echoed through the tunnels. A low, guttural growl that froze them all in place. The growl was followed by a series of rapid, skittering noises, like claws scraping against concrete. The group huddled together, their flashlights darting across the darkness in search of the source. "What was that?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. No one answered. The sound grew louder, closer, echoing off the walls and making it impossible to pinpoint its direction. "We need to go," Ryan said, his voice firm. But before they could move, two glowing eyes appeared in the darkness ahead, reflecting the light from their flashlights. They were too high off the ground to belong to a rat, too far apart to be human. The creature emerged slowly, its grotesque form illuminated in fragments, elongated limbs, matted fur, claws that glinted like knives. It let out another growl, its lips peeling back to reveal rows of jagged teeth. The group froze in terror, unable to process what they were seeing. "Run!" Ryan shouted, snapping them out of their paralysis. The group scattered, their panicked footsteps echoing wildly. Emily and Ryan sprinted down one tunnel, while Marcus and Mia took another. The creature moved with unnatural speed, its skittering steps reverberating through the labyrinth. Emily's chest burned as she ran, her flashlight bobbing wildly. Ryan stayed close, glancing over his shoulder to make sure the creature wasn't following them. A distant scream echoed through the tunnels, making them both stop in their tracks. "Marcus?" Emily called out, her voice breaking. Ryan grabbed her arm. "We can't stop. We have to keep moving." They turned a corner and saw a faint light ahead, an emergency exit sign. Renewed hope propelled them forward, but the skittering noises were back, growing louder with each passing second. They reached the ladder and scrambled up, Ryan pushing Emily ahead of him. As she climbed, she glanced down and saw the creature's glowing eyes at the base of the ladder. It lunged upward, its claws scraping against the metal, narrowly missing Ryan's foot. They burst out onto the street, gasping for air. The city lights felt surreal after the oppressive darkness below. For a moment, neither of them spoke, too shaken to process what had happened. "Where's Marcus?" Emily finally asked, her voice trembling. Ryan shook his head, unable to answer. The police listened to their story with skepticism, but agreed to search the tunnels. The next day, a team descended into the depths, but no creature was found. The searchers did, however, discover a disturbing trail of blood leading into an unexplored section of the tunnels. Marcus and Mia were officially listed as missing. The authorities chalked it up to a tragic accident, dismissing the teenager's account as hysteria. But Emily and Ryan knew better. They'd seen the creature, felt its presence, and barely escaped with their lives. They stopped exploring after that, the thrill of adventure forever replaced by the memory of glowing eyes in the dark. A week later, a maintenance worker ventured into the tunnels to inspect a reported power outage. As he worked, a faint skittering noise reached his ears. He turned, shining his flashlight into the darkness. Two glowing eyes stared back at him before the light flickered out, leaving the tunnel in complete silence. It was a quiet night in the suburbs, the kind where the world felt still, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Hannah, a college student, walked briskly down the empty sidewalk, clutching her bag to her chest. She had stayed late on campus to finish a group project and was now heading home. The street lights cast long shadows, and the familiar houses lining the street seemed eerily silent. She'd walked this route dozens of times before, but something about tonight felt different. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Dismissing the thought as paranoia, she picked up her pace, her sneakers scuffing against the pavement. Just a few more blocks to her house, she told herself. But then she saw him. Under the glow of a street light about 50 feet ahead stood a man. He was motionless, his hands at his sides and staring directly at her. He wore an old-fashioned suit, which you might see in black and white photos from decades ago. But it wasn't his clothing that unsettled her. It was his smile. His lips were stretched into an impossibly wide grin, revealing too many teeth. The smile didn't reach his eyes, which were cold and unblinking. Hannah froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, neither of them moved. She thought about crossing the street, but something told her not to turn her back on him. Instead, she took a hesitant step forward, then another, keeping her eyes on him the entire time. As she drew closer, the man's head tilted slightly to the side, his grin widening even further. Her heart pounded in her chest. When she was about 20 feet away, he moved. Not a step, but a shift, a subtle sway forward, as though his body was urging her to come closer. "Hey," she said weakly, her voice trembling. "Do you need help?" He didn't respond. Instead, he took a step toward her, then another. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, like a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. Hannah's instincts screamed at her to run. She shot out a quick glance and reached up. She turned and bolted, her bag bouncing against her hip as she sprinted down the street. She glanced over her shoulder and saw him following her, still walking at that same unnervingly steady pace. His smile never faltered. Hannah's lungs burned as she ran, her house finally coming into view at the end of the block. She fumbled for her keys as she reached the front door, her fingers trembling so badly that she nearly dropped them. With a desperate shove, she unlocked the door and slammed it shut behind her, locking the deadbolt. Her heart thundered in her chest as she leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath. She peeked through the peephole but saw nothing. For a moment, she thought she was safe. Then she heard it, a soft tap on the window. Hannah's blood ran cold. She turned slowly and saw him standing in the driveway, illuminated by the porch light. He was still smiling, his head tilted slightly as if in amusement. He raised a hand and waved at her, a slow, deliberate gesture that made her stomach churn. She backed away from the window, her mind racing. Should she call the police? Would they even believe her? She crept to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and locked herself in her bedroom. All night she listened for sounds of movement outside, but none came. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and she drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, sunlight streamed through her blinds, and the events of the night before felt almost like a bad dream. But when she stepped outside to check her driveway, she froze. In the dew on her car's windshield, someone had drawn a smiley face. Shaken, she walked over to her neighbor's house to see if they had noticed anything strange. Mrs. Carter, an older woman who lived alone, always greeted her with a warm smile and a cup of coffee when Hannah visited. But today, the house was eerily quiet. Hannah knocked on the door, no answer. She peered through the front window and saw Mrs. Carter sitting in her armchair, her face pale and lifeless. The police arrived soon after, and the scene was cordoned off as an apparent natural death. But Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to the man she'd seen. Later that evening, she overheard one of the officers talking about the case. "Security footage from last night," he said, "shows a man standing outside her window for hours, just standing there, smiling." Hannah's stomach dropped. She locked every door and window in her house that night, but it did little to ease her fear. Days passed, and the police investigation turned up nothing. No one could identify the man on the footage. He had no discernible features beyond his unsettling smile. Some speculated it was a prank or an actor playing a cruel joke. But Hannah knew better. She couldn't forget the way he had followed her, the way his eyes seemed to pierce right through her. Every night, she double-checked her locks and kept her curtains drawn. But even that didn't bring her peace. One evening, as she sat in her living room trying to focus on a book, she felt it again, the sensation of being watched. Her hands trembled as she forced herself to look out the window. Under the streetlight he stood, smiling,